Welcome, truth seekers. There is a verse in the Quran that will frame our journey and demand our attention, and it speaks plainly that there is no compulsion in religion, a command that seems to mock the history that followed in the Iberian Peninsula. Imagine a people whose cities once rang with the call to prayer, whose poets and jurists and farmers together shaped a civilization, and then were commanded in a single generation to change the deepest facts of their souls. What happened to those men and women who took baptismal water but kept the names, the prayers, and the memory of Mecca in their private mouths? And how did that hidden life shape the world that followed, both on the peninsula and across the sea? A story of quiet resistance and unbearable loss. Welcome to Unleash Facts, the place where history secrets, unsolved mysteries, and mind-blowing truths come to light. Before the fall of the last Muslim polity in the peninsula, there was a layered reality in which Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived in unequal but tangible proximity, a world whose rhythms were set by agricultural seasons, legal pluralities, and intimate cultural borrowings that left traces in language, cuisine, and law. When Granada surrendered in 1492, the treaty that closed the siege promised protections for the conquered population, protections that were supposed to allow Muslims to keep their religion, property, and customs under Christian sovereignty, a fragile guarantee that would soon be strained and then ruptured. The first fractures appeared quickly as missionary zeal and political fear combined, and within a few years, statesmen and clerics in Christian courts began insisting that outward conformity would replace the plural settlement the treaty had tried to secure. The first great moment of rupture came not as a single act, but as a sequence of pressures and legal measures, and these included royal edicts that narrowed room for Islamic practice and local campaigns of forced conversion that made entire communities choose baptism or exile. Communities who had been called mudéjars under Christian rule were gradually recategorized and derided as Moriscos after conversion, a new name that marked a people in terms of their supposed impurity and that carried with it both social stigma and constant surveillance. When missionary bishops like Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros pressed harshly for mass baptisms, when royal commissions demanded that Arabic teachings be replaced and mosques be closed or converted, what remained in private began to take on an existence of its own, folded into homes, whispered instructions, and clandestine manuscripts. Those manuscripts, written in Arabic script but in Castilian and in the Romance vernaculars of the peninsula, form one of our clearest windows into the inner life of those communities. And scholars now call that body of writing Aljamiado, a practice that preserved prayers, Qur'anic passages, devotional manuals, and legal memory in a script that would not be recognized by Christian authorities at a casual glance. Among these survivals are what modern researchers call Morisco Qur'ans, partial or selective codices that copy passages of the Quran and sometimes provide translations into Castilian in Arabic script, a testament to devotional persistence and to the practical need of people who had lost access to formal religious instruction. The physical reality of those books, often hidden in ceilings, buried beneath hearths, or smuggled out of the peninsula in the chaos of expulsions, shows us that religion endured not only in memory, but in concrete textual practice, even as the public language of the realm declared Islam illegal. Resistance and compliance braided together in patterns that were at once quiet and occasionally explosive, because dissimulation can be a strategy of endurance and also an object of deep suspicion. Two uprisings, one at the very start of the 16th century and another in the second half of that century, demonstrate the limits of coercion and the combustible consequences of demographic displacement, economic pressure, and religious humiliation. The rebellion of the Alpujarras erupted first when villagers who had lived under the terms of Granada's capitulation saw those terms violated, and their desperation became an armed insurrection that the crown crushed, offering exile or baptism to entire communities in its aftermath. Later, The rebellion that began in 1568 under the leadership of figures who styled themselves with ancestral names shook the southern slopes of the Sierra Nevada and forced the crown to deploy armies in a brutal repression that ended with deportations, dispersal of populations, and a policy aimed at destroying the geographic concentration that made collective identity possible. After those mountains quieted, the Spanish state pursued a strategy of deliberate fragmentation, relocating Moriscos from their native regions, banning Arabic speech in public, forbidding Muslim dress, and encouraging the settling of Christian tenants in lands once tilled by Morisco hands. These measures aimed to unmake a culture that had taken centuries to form, and they reveal how state violence and social engineering can be subtle as well as spectacular. What followed for many was an outward Christianity that became a performance required by law, and an inward Islam that became a guarded practice of memory and private ritual. Men who had been imams lost their public function but taught secret prayers in kitchens and courtyards. Mothers kept recipes and rules for halal food traditions that survived through careful avoidance, and families marked births and deaths with gestures that only insiders could read. Evidence from inquisitorial records shows accusations and confessions that often read like snapshots of private devotion. Confessions of fasting in Ramadan, of praying in Arabic and whispering the Shahada into the infant's ear, of circumcisions performed in secrecy, and of Qur'anic verses recited behind closed doors, each small act charged with both spiritual meaning and mortal risk. The Inquisition's files, when we open them with modern eyes, tell stories of ordinary people forced into paths of constant calculation, and they show how accusation could be both a tool of discipline and a theater of public humiliation. Families reported neighbors to authorities under pressure or in hope of reward, and sometimes accusations came from rival Christians who wanted to seize property. A reminder that persecution is rarely a simple clash of faith, but a set of incentives and violences embedded in everyday life. Yet alongside those confessions runs a different archive, the archive of devotion preserved in Aljamiado codices, in household liturgies, and in the memory of songs and poems that communities recited to themselves, all of which point to an identity that could not be entirely erased by legal fiat. The larger political currents of the Mediterranean made the Morisco question into an international problem, because Spain's rulers feared that those they distrusted at home might form secret alliances with rival powers abroad. Rumors and real encounters with the Ottoman world, with corsairs from North Africa and with exiles who landed in ports of Algiers or Tetuan, fed a narrative among the Spanish elite that Moriscos might act as a fifth column in times of war. That fear, whether imagined or real, became a decisive element in the policies of the Habsburg court as Spain entered an era of fiscal strain and military overreach. A context that made radical solutions to the Morisco problem feel politically attractive. In the first years of the 17th century, those political appetites found an instrument in the person of Philip III, and in advisors who argued that expulsion was both a spiritual cure and a political necessity, an act that would cleanse the realm of suspected heresy and secure the coasts against imagined treachery. The 1609 decree that began the systematic expulsion was not improvised. It was the outcome of decades of pressure, repeated petitions from churchmen and local elites, and calculations about money, security, and identity that seemed chillingly modern in their bureaucratic logic. The operation was organized region by region, beginning where the authorities believed Morisco concentrations were strongest, and it was executed in ways that mixed secrecy with public spectacle, with entire villages emptied and citizens loaded onto ships bound for North Africa and for ports where the language and faith of exile awaited them. Numbers, as historians now remind us, are always contested, and the precise scale of the expulsion, the count of those who left and those who remained, has been revised and debated by successive scholars, a dispute that reveals how modern historiography continually re-examines what seem to be settled facts. Traditional estimates suggested several 100,000 were expelled, while more recent demographic studies propose wider ranges and call attention to the households that escaped official lists by hiding in mountains, integrating into Christian communities, or fleeing earlier to North Africa. What cannot be disputed is the human cost in lives interrupted, labor lost, and cultural formations dispersed across the Mediterranean, a diaspora that remade the social and economic map of regions such as Valencia, Murcia, and Granada. Those who were expelled carried with them the things that could not be taken by law, and that cultural freight reshaped places where the Morisco exiles landed, and it enriched the Ottoman and Maghrebi cities that received them with skills, crafts, culinary knowledge, and a tragic repertory of memory. Port cities like Algiers, Tunis, and the Galata quarter of Istanbul recorded the arrival of Andalusian artisans and scholars who became part of new networks of trade and learning, and their presence helped bind the Western Mediterranean to a shared cultural substrate that blurred the lines of empire. At the same time, some who were expelled attempted to return secretly to the peninsula or to live as clandestine Muslims within Christian society, a pattern that would re-emerge in later centuries under different names and in different contexts. The story of survival is not only a story of resistance, it is also a story of transformation, because the language of faith had to adapt to new materials. And this adaptation left marks that scholars can now read. Aljamiado texts show linguistic hybridity, the insertion of Arabic formulas into Castilian syntax, and an imagistic piety that mixed Qur'anic recitation with local devotional genres, producing prayer books and didactic texts meant to be learned by rote and passed from mother to child. Those manuscripts sometimes include marginalia that explain Arabic words in Romance terms, and they sometimes reproduce rituals in a way that suggests community teaching, even when organized mosques no longer existed. A vivid record of faithful continuity amid legal annihilation. Underneath the public rhetoric of purification, there were negotiations and compromises, and historians who examine wills, land records, and municipal archives find instances of Christians who adopted Morisco servants, of intermarriage in frontier zones, and of old neighbors who found practical accommodations that law could not entirely override. At the same time, the state escalated its surveillance apparatus, and the Inquisition remained a brutal, intimate technology of classification that could define and redefine belonging with a notary's signature and a sentence. When we read the confessions, the depositions, and the legal exchanges, we confront a society in which identity could be reconfigured by coercion, but also reconstructed by memory. And the two processes happened at the same time in the lives of many families. If you listen closely to the texts left behind, you can hear a different theological vocabulary emerge in private devotion, a vocabulary that stresses endurance, patience, and the sanctity of hidden worship, a vocabulary shaped by lived necessity rather than formal scholastic argument. These devotional modes sometimes invoke Qur'anic verses, sometimes quote hadith, and sometimes invent devotional formulas that serve immediate needs, such as prayers to be whispered in the dark or ways to observe fasts when communal iftars were impossible. And this improvisation itself became a form of religious creativity. It would be a mistake to see these practices solely as survival strategies, because they were also acts of cultural continuity that maintained theological coherence even as institutional structures vanished. The tension between accusation and memory continued even after expulsion, because some Moriscos stayed behind or managed to return, and their descendants carried traces of Islamic practice that would surface in later inquisitorial prosecutions and in folkloric practices recorded by observers in the 17th and 18th centuries. There are cases, documented in both Christian and Muslim archives, of Morisco communities persisting in remote valleys long after official policies declared the peninsula cleansed, a fact that complicates any simple narrative of disappearance. Modern scholars who comb regional records find families that continued to observe anti-language rituals, that retained culinary distinctions, and that preserved songs and genealogies that kept the memory of Andalusian origins alive across generations. The Morisco story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the meaning of conversion and the limits of state power, because the conversion demanded in the 16th century was often a social technology intended to reshape who belonged within the polity, and yet belief persisted in forms that the law could not completely police. Why did some communities choose exile while others accepted baptism and kept private faith? And how did gender, class, and geography influence these choices? Questions that remind us the past was lived in contingencies and moral dilemmas rather than in abstract doctrines. These questions matter now because they speak to how identity is negotiated under pressure, how memory survives repression, and how cultural forms can be both resilient and vulnerable to institutional violence. The full depth of this revelation is preserved in the meticulous chronicles of early historians who fled to North Africa, and in the secret devotionals that survived in private hands. And every reader or listener who wants to follow this history further will find rich primary accounts in Arabic, as well as dense archival records in Castilian, documents that reward patient, careful study. If you are moved by this history, consider returning to the primary chronicles of al-Maqqari and to the modern critical studies that examine Aljamiado manuscripts and inquisitorial files. For those works, let the voices of ordinary people speak through legal forms and devotional margins, and they will repay close attention. As we close this narrative reflection, consider what the Morisco experience teaches about memory, belonging, and the price of forced conformity. Lessons that are not merely historical because our present repeatedly confronts similar dilemmas of identity, coercion, and cultural erasure. The hidden prayers, the translated Qur'anic excerpts, and the emigrant communities that rerouted themselves across the Mediterranean together tell a story of survival that is both tragic and stubbornly human, and they call on us to measure the costs of policies that aim to remake souls by law. This history leaves us with a question that will keep returning to our minds, a question about how communities hold on to what matters most when the public world demands their surrender, and it challenges us to think about the moral responsibilities of those who hold power. Thank you for listening to this account, and I encourage you to look into the archives and manuscript catalogues if you desire to verify and to deepen your understanding, because history becomes truer the more readers engage directly with the documents and the less it depends on second-hand retellings. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.